Marigolds. Characterization. The characters. The main characters in Marigolds are Elizabeth, Miss Lottie, Joey, and Elizabeth's parents. Elizabeth is the story's narrator and protagonist. As a 14-year-old, she is moving from the carelessness of childhood to the conscientiousness of adulthood. Miss Lottie is an elderly neighbor who tends to her beloved marigolds, which represent the possibility of beauty amid deprivation. Joey is Elizabeth's mischievous younger brother. Elizabeth's parents are caring but often absent and preoccupied, particularly due to the economic concerns. Elizabeth. Elizabeth, the story's narrator and protagonist, is a woman reflecting on her childhood and adolescence spent growing up in an impoverished black community in rural Maryland during the Great Depression. Early on in the narrative, she and the other neighborhood children are somewhat insulated from recognizing the full extent of their poverty. As her story progresses, she begins to see the world from a new, more mature perspective. Her sense of the world around her shifts dramatically, and she comes to recognize the harshness of her surroundings. Elizabeth recalls one event that feels particularly representative of her transition from girlhood to womanhood. One day, with her younger brother Joey and some other neighborhood kids, she decides to antagonize their elderly neighbor, Miss Lottie. Despite some early trepidation that this kind of playing might be too silly for her now that she is entering adolescence, Elizabeth herself winds up leading the group in an unusually raucous charge. They chant, call Miss Lottie names, and attempt to destroy her prized marigold garden. Later, Elizabeth feels ashamed at her part in the cruelty. She begins to feel that maybe she is now more a woman than a child. That night, Elizabeth hears her father cry for the first time. Just as her sense of self is upended by the day's juvenile transgressions, her sense of the world around her is upended by her father's expressions of frustration and anguish in being unable to find work. Struggling to grapple with the difficult world around her, Elizabeth lashes out. In a fit of confusion and rage, she destroys Miss Lottie's cherished marigolds. In the immediate aftermath of the destruction, Elizabeth begins to see the world more clearly and finally starts to understand the impact of what she has done. This moment, present day Elizabeth recalls, is the first moment in which she sees a kind of reality which is hidden to childhood. For the first time, Elizabeth recognizes Miss Lottie's circumstances and humanity, helping her to better understand her own. Miss Lottie, at the beginning of the story, Miss Lottie, Elizabeth's elderly neighbor, is framed as a kind of antagonist, an imposing, stern, elderly woman. Miss Lottie is the target of the neighborhood kids who make a sport of taunting her, damaging her prized marigolds, and calling her a witch. They circulate legends about her amongst themselves, viewing her as an almost mythical villain instead of a woman from the neighborhood. Grappling with a mixture of difficult emotions, Elizabeth flies into a fit of rage and confusion and single-handedly uproots her whole garden. After her tantrum, she finally begins to see Miss Lottie as human, no longer a witch, she recalls, but only a broken old woman who had dared to create beauty in the midst of ugliness and sterility. This moment marks Elizabeth's awareness of her own transition from childhood into womanhood. Her new understanding of Miss Lottie allows her to better understand the difficult circumstances surrounding them all. Moreover, Elizabeth comes to appreciate Miss Lottie's attempts to foster beauty and hope amid those circumstances. Joey. Joey is Elizabeth's brother and is 3 years her junior, meaning 3 years younger. So she's 14, he's 11. The two are close friends, and though they often argue and disagree, in Marigold's, Joey serves a sidekick of sorts to Elizabeth. He is always at her side and seems at first to take directions from her. When she leads the neighborhood kids in their boisterous campaign against Miss Lottie, he is excited to engage. Despite his enthusiasm and bravado, he is somewhat afraid of Miss Lottie, like his fake braveness or his fake courage. Later, when Elizabeth gets up in the middle of the night and destroys Miss Lottie's flower bed, Joey follows. He begs her to stop, but she ignores his pleas. Elizabeth's parents. Elizabeth's parents are portrayed as caring but often absent. Her mother, Maybelle, does domestic work, and her father is searching for work without success. Elizabeth describes her mother as having a soothing voice, and late in the story, Elizabeth expresses her longing to see her mother more often. She describes her father as a strong and capable, a man who would teach his children to hunt, whittle toys for them, and carry them around on his shoulders. One night, Elizabeth wakes and hears her mother attempting to soothe her father, who is feeling especially distraught over his inability to find work and provide for their family. When she sees her mother's strength and her father's unexpected sorrow and vulnerability, she is unable to make sense of the shift. The world had lost its boundary lines, she recalls.